Let's shift it over to the AFC, and let's jump into the confident bucket. Who are we confident is breaking out from this conference this year?
So this is a group where I'm sure some people are going to be like, obviously these guys, they've already broken out to some extent, right? What are you even wasting our time talking about these guys for? But I think they could all take their games to another level next year. That starts with Harmon Hampton on the Chargers. We stick with the sophomore backs, Travion Henderson on the Patriots, RJ Harvey on the Broncos. And then we got to say something nice about the Bills today. So we'll highlight Dalton Kincaid on the Bills, who was well on his way to a breakout this season.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for injuries derailing him again. And I mean, for Hampton, RB16 in fantasy points per game, and he missed 7 games. So it was a bit of a smaller sample size, missed some time due to injury there, but double-digit fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 outings. That's despite all the offensive line injuries that we discussed all year long, how things for this offense really didn't look the same as the season went along. And I think those offensive line injuries were a big part of it. So you hope for some better injury luck for their O-line next year. Plus, if he gets Mike McDaniel here as his offensive coordinator, this is incredible. Like, this is so good for him. We know what kind of coach McDaniel is. The offensive game is going to be great for them. The rushing attack, though, he comes from the 49ers system. Like, I don't see how anyone couldn't look at this and think this is just a massive win for the Chargers as a whole, but especially for Hampton here. So really, really like him. I think a monster year is coming. And honestly, based on the stats in some of those games this year, I think we could have seen a monster season this year if he didn't get hurt. Travion Henderson, I know people are so frustrated, like Ramondre Stevenson, when he's been out there kind of holding him back, still heavily involved. But I think next year we'll see him take his game to another level. We'll see him become that weekly fantasy difference maker. I mean, he was a top 10 fantasy back over the final 8 weeks. And I know Stevenson wasn't out there for some of those games, but Harmon, I'll bring it up again. I've compared kind of his career ascension here, the early part of his career, to what we saw from Jahmyr Gibbs, right? Jahmyr Gibbs splitting. I mean, to this day, Jahmyr Gibbs is still splitting to some extent, but we've seen him take on a much bigger role over the different seasons for the Lions. And I think if you look at Gibbs' rookie year, right, he was the RB11 in fantasy points per game. He only played 56% of the snaps. His final stat line for the year, 945 rushing yards, 316 receiving yards, 11 total touchdowns. Would you guess that Henderson ended this year with 911 rushing yards, 221 receiving yards, so a little less there, and 10 total touchdowns? Like a very similar finish to what we saw from Gibbs. We've seen that explosive ability from him. I know people are still going to have their doubts. I mean, I put this article out and it got some comments on it right away of people saying like I was, discounting Ramondre Stevenson and everything he's done this year. But I think this is the trajectory that Henderson is going to be on, that they're going to just continue to give him more and more. This is an offense that we expect to continue ascending. Really, really like him next year. RJ Harvey, RB9 in fantasy points per game from week 11 on, and that was once J.K. Dobbins was ruled out for the rest of the regular season. We saw Harvey have 2 top 10 weekly finishes before that. He was the RB22 in fantasy points per game this season. I think we see him take on even more next year and him start to continue to ascend as a meaningful fantasy piece, an RB2 with some RB1 upside there. I think all those guys are very exciting. And then, like I said, for Dalton Kincaid, the 3rd most fantasy points among tight ends through the first 5 weeks, despite the fact only playing around 50% of the Bills' offensive snaps again. He maintained his 11.3 fantasy points per game. If he maintained that throughout the whole season, that would have made him finish as the tight end 5 on the year if he had continued that, if he hadn't gotten hurt, if he hadn't had everything derailed by the injuries. So later in the season, after the injuries occurred, he was only playing about 38% of the snaps, just not the same player. You worry about the durability for sure, because this isn't the first time this has happened, but he showed us this year he can be that top 5 guy, and he was doing it on efficiency. If we get a little more volume for him, and of course, I would be shocked if the Bills don't go out and do something massive at wide receiver to bolster that room this offseason. So that'll factor in as well. But Kincaid definitely showed us this year that he can be a meaningful fantasy player and a pretty strong starter for our offenses, at least when he's healthy.
I think Kincaid, definitely, if he could stay healthy, that's a breakout candidate. I'm with you with Harmon and Hampton 100%. I actually think one thing that people might overthink is how does Hampton fit into Mike McDaniel's more outside zone rushing system. But I actually think we saw this year that Hampton kind of struggled with some of the gap scheme responsibilities early on in Greg Roman's offense, and obviously then he got hurt. It's hard to know what would have happened as the season went on. He sort of started to kind of pick it up, but like guys like Matt Waldman and James Coe both like studied running backs and said that might happen for Hampton. So a zone system where it's just this is the defined hole, go hit it, let's go. I think that actually might be better for Hampton. The two running backs, Henderson and Harvey, I think are tougher for me to get full. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, but a little bit tougher for me to get fully on board with. Henderson, you could definitely tell that story that you mentioned about Jahmyr Gibbs, but it probably has to bother you a little bit, Boone, that Ramondre Stevenson has 34 opportunities in the playoffs so far, Traven Henderson 24, and yards from scrimmage-wise in the two playoff games, it's not even close. 209 for Ramondre Stevenson, 59 for Travion Henderson. You certainly would have liked him to continue that upward trajectory in the postseason, but like Stevenson has been the guy and been very good in the playoffs so far.
He has been. And to continue with like the Gibbs comparison thing, we saw those other backs with the Lions heavily involved, right? And at times they kind of rode the hot hand, whether it was Jamal Williams, whether it was David Montgomery. They've let the bigger backs, the other guys, take the lead at certain times, especially earlier in Gibbs' career. And then as things have gone along, Gibbs has slowly emerged. Now, I'm not saying that I think Henderson is necessarily going to be a top 2 or top 3 fantasy running back like we've seen Gibbs become, but we're talking about a breakout. If he emerges as a top 15 fantasy back next year consistently, I think we're good. That's the breakout. That's the guy that you want your lineup, and you're going to have some spike weeks there just based on the type of player he is and the explosiveness and the game-breaking ability. So, yes, it's still a bit of a stretch on him, but I'm pretty confident in the player. I really liked him coming out, talked about him basically all year long, was just kind of waiting. And when he got his opportunity, was great to see him run with it. So, yes, Stevenson is there. It's still kind of lowering the ceiling for the moment, but we're projecting ahead, right? This isn't what's happening right now. This is what we're expecting next year. And I think after a full offseason, preparing, looking at the pieces they have, why would they not want to get Henderson more work as they get more comfortable too with him in the offense? You know, he's still just a rookie this year. So as they get more comfortable with him, as they trust him more out there, I think he'll continue to get more opportunity and he'll be a really strong piece in fantasy lineups.
Yeah, he'll be a really fascinating ADP to kind of track this offseason. Like, where does he end up going once we get into August drafts? Let's get into the hopeful bunch here. We've got 4 players to go through in this group.
All right, Quinshon Judkins on the Browns, who had a very strong start to the season. I think he showed us everything we needed to see in terms of him being a talented player, a guy who can get it done in the pros. Now we just need to find out whether the Browns can get the environment around him to allow him to really find his fantasy ceiling. Jaden Higgins on the Texans, sort of blocked by Nico Collins being there as the number 1 guy, but we saw some flashes from him for sure this year. Josh Downs on the Colts. Alec Pierce is going to be a free agent this offseason. We'll see what the Colts decide to do, whether they try to find a way to bring him back or not. But it looks like there could be an opportunity for Josh Downs, who I believe we are both fans of in terms of his talent, and we'd like to see him get a bigger opportunity in that offense to see what he could do. And then Bashal Tutin, another one of these guys that we talked up before the year, and we thought he'd have a chance to eventually make a dent in that Jaguars backfield. Never really happened. He scored a bunch of touchdowns. He flashed a bit, but Trevor Etienne was just good. He held on to that job. He was really good this year, but he's heading to free agency now. And what happens there? Did he do enough for the Jags to offer him a contract to get him back there? Or do they view Tutin as potentially that guy that could take over as the starting back? And if that happens, Harmon, then it is just Tutin to the moon. It is a guy who's going to be an RB2 in fantasy, another one of these guys that has that RB1 upside. We saw some of the bigger plays this year, that nose for the end zone. Still really like him in an offense that for sure is ascending, that we want to invest in, that we want pieces of as well.
Yeah, Tutin's really interesting. Free agency with Travis Etienne is going to be a big one because obviously he was really good for them, but you wonder if Liam Cohen thinks he can recreate that with another guy and just like his scheme overall. That should be interesting to track. On Josh Downs, oh, man, I love Josh Downs, but there's no doubt he took a step back last year statistically. I still think he's a really good player. You mentioned Alec Pierce, a free agent. an interesting situation to monitor here. And this is something I was talking about with some of the folks in the Reception Perception Discord a couple of weeks ago. And a couple of reporters have started to theorize this as well. There's actually a scenario where Michael Pittman could be released or traded by this team in a cap-saving move, just where he is right now financially, and they could potentially use those resources to actually bring back Alec Pierce, either on the franchise tag or an extension. Interesting because Pittman is like a Colts lifer. He's a big-time culture guy there, but there is a chance that he's played his last down for the Colts. And if that's the case and they bring back Pierce, I think Downs is good enough to start outside at the flanker position for this team. Now, he's a smaller guy. He's not as big as Pittman, but that would be a more immediate path for him to get that playing time promotion, because there's really the depth on this team beyond those guys, which is ironic because heading into the year, it's like they've got 4 good receivers with Pierce, Downs, Mitchell, and Pittman. And now it's like, well, now they might be down 2 of those guys that we thought coming into this year. They might no longer be on the roster. It would just be interesting to see if they believe that Downs can be a full-time player, because he's a smaller guy. You know, you wonder if his body can hold up to the workload, but obviously love the talent. And if Pittman's not on the team, that increases the odds, I think, even more than if Pierce is not on the team, that he could become that breakout candidate. So I think these are 4 really good ones here. Higgins is interesting in Houston as well, because you imagine all the vets are going to get cleared out. It'll be Nico, Jaden Higgins, and Jalen Nolan. Potentially Tank Dell may be coming back from a very serious injury. We'll see what he looks like potentially.
Yeah, with Higgins, I mean, at least 50 yards and or a touchdown in 6 of his last 9 games. Kind of quietly did that. It was usable for fantasy. 2 for 88 and a touchdown in the fantasy championship. And I think he did really look like a player that could be that number 2 in the offense. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I really do think that he could be a strong number 2 even in this offense. They got some things to sort out in the offensive line. CJ Stroud definitely has to improve his game, and they got to continue to improve that environment around him and try to get it a little closer to what he had in that rookie season. I think that's a big part of what's happened with him, that he had just a really ideal setup in that first year. And then some of those things kind of chipped away, and maybe Stroud got too much of that credit in that first season, right? And now people started to think, okay, he's this guy that's going to elevate everyone around him, when in reality, maybe he's not. Maybe he kind of needs that really nice setup, those strong pieces around him, in order for him to be a good fantasy asset and for him to have the kind of year that he had as a rookie. So we'll see what they do this offseason. But yeah, the fact that we saw Higgins actually producing down the stretch, that's what you want to see from a rookie wideout, especially a rookie wideout who's trapped behind a superstar number 1 receiver.
All right, we've got 4 longer shots here in the final bucket. There's some deep names on this one, other than the number 1 overall pick from last year's draft.
Yeah, and Cam Ward, I've said this before, he's another guy, kind of like Tyler Shuck, where I really don't know what the fantasy ceiling is for him. Doesn't offer that much in terms of rushing ability. So a breakout for him would just be them getting him some better weapons, him starting to produce like maybe a top 15 fantasy quarterback. I'm still looking at him as QB2 for fantasy next year, but we could see with a new coaching staff, with an off season to get some new pieces around him, we could see him certainly take a step forward in that offense. Braylon Allen, I think I snuck this one in on last week's show. We were talking about Breece Hall, and I mentioned just keep an eye on those other backs for the Jets, because if Breece Hall leaves in free agency, there's at least a non-zero chance that we could see Braylon Allen, who's the next man up, sneak into that starting role next year. A lot to be figured out there. That's why we're talking about some deep names. Keaton Mitchell, going back to that rookie season, so explosive. Kind of looks like he is moving at a different speed than other players on the field. Dealt with serious injuries. The start of this year, couldn't even get in the game day lineup, right? He was struggling to have a role in the offense, but then once they get him back out there, what does he do? He starts to make big plays again. He starts to produce. And Derrick Henry on the wrong side of 30, going into his 11th season next year. I think it makes a lot of sense for them to get Keaton Mitchell more involved, and for Keaton Mitchell to potentially be that guy if Derrick Henry does succumb to an injury. Keaton Mitchell being that guy who would probably still need someone else. I don't think he's a big volume back based on his size and the type of runner that he is, but somebody that I think could really dominate, could really put up big stats, even if he only is getting, 8 to 12 touches a week or something like that. He's that kind of explosive player. And then one that I find so interesting, this is now, and we're going to talk about some dynasty stuff in the next segment, but Eric All Jr., I should say, I don't want to disrespect him in any way here. A name that people probably forget. He is the Bengals tight end. He has dealt with injuries since he got into the league, and that was after coming into the league, them getting him at a big-time discount because he was coming off an ACL tear in college. He comes into the league. His first 9 games, he starts to produce. In 7 of those first 9 outings, he had multiple catches. That was as a rookie. Then he tears his ACL again, dealing with injuries again, misses this entire season, totally forgotten. And yet he's the kind of player who I think he's supposed to come back. Very positive update on him in November that he's running routes again. He's expected to be cleared by the end of the season, so he should be ready to go for all the offseason activities. And who's he going to have to compete with? 31-year-old Mike Gesicki this year. Noah Fant's going to be a free agent. So I think Eric All Jr. is somebody that you could look on your waiver wire. In a competitive league, he might be scooped up. Some of the deeper leagues that I'm in, he's already taken. But in a lot of leagues, he's going to be out there on the waiver wire. And I think he's somebody that could eventually emerge as the Bengals starting tight end. A really good receiving back. Still has to prove himself as a blocker, especially, inline blocking. He's got some work to do there. He's been out, though. Let's hope he's been, getting himself ready for this. He could come back and be a meaningful fantasy player, but this is a long shot. That's why we're mentioning him here.
Eric All Jr. is such a perfect sicko name to end the breakout segments on. That's a really good one. I do wonder if at any point the Bengals might look to we need another dimension here beyond just Chase and Higgins. That's obviously good enough, but if they just add something else to the offense, so that tight end position is certainly worth monitoring.